I was working the front desk at a hotel in Amsterdam when an American guest walked up to me, visibly annoyed. He slapped his credit card on the counter and said he wanted to dispute a charge. I asked what the problem was. He pointed at his bill and said, "You charged me twice for breakfast. It says here 15 euros, but my card shows $18. I looked at him. I looked at the bill. I said, "Sir, euros and dollars are different currencies." He stared at me like I'd just told him the earth was flat. This kind of story isn't rare. And if you're the kind of person who values cultural awareness over outrage, this is the perspective I share here regularly. "Yeah, but you still charged me wrong," he insisted. I pulled up the exchange rate on my computer, showed him that 15 euros was actually about $16.50, plus his bank probably added a foreign transaction fee. He looked at the screen for a solid 10 seconds. Then he said, "Well, you should have told me that when I checked in." I had. It was literally written on the paper he signed. Another time, I watched an American couple argue with a waiter in Barcelona for 20 minutes because their free water came in a bottle and cost 3 euros. The waiter explained that in Spain, restaurants charge for bottled water. Tap water isn't commonly served. The husband wasn't having it. He said, "In America, water is free. That's how civilized countries do it." The waiter just nodded slowly and walked away. The couple sat there fuming, refusing to pay for the water, but also refusing to send it back because they'd already drunk half of it. My friend works at a train station in Berlin. She told me about an American tourist who missed his train and blamed the schedule. He said the departure time was wrong because it showed 14:45 and his phone said 2:45 p.m. She explained that Europe uses 24-hour time. He said, "That's confusing. Why don't you just use normal time?" She asked what he meant by normal time. He said, "Like, with AM and PM. You know, the standard way." She told him that most of the world uses 24-hour time. He shook his head and said, "Well, most of the world is doing it wrong then." I think that's the thing that gets me. It's not that Americans don't know these things. It's that when they find out they're wrong, the instinct isn't to learn. It's to explain why everyone else should change. And I get it. I really do. When you grow up in a country that tells you it's the best at everything, it's hard to accept that maybe some things work differently elsewhere. But watching it happen in real time? It's like watching someone argue with gravity. I track this pattern constantly. And if understanding that mindset shift matters to you, you're in the right place. I was helping an American tourist in a pharmacy in London. She wanted fever medicine for her kid. I asked what temperature the child had. She said, 103. I paused. I said, 103 Celsius? She looked at me like I was insane. No, Fahrenheit, obviously. I had to explain that we use Celsius in the UK. 103 Fahrenheit is about 39 Celsius. She seemed surprised that I even knew what Fahrenheit was. Then she asked why we didn't just use Fahrenheit since it's easier. I asked how it was easier. She said, "Because everyone knows it." I said, "Everyone in America knows it." She said, "Right. Everyone." A guy came into the hardware store where I worked in Toronto. He needed screws. I asked what size. He said, 3/4 of an inch. I showed him the metric section. He got frustrated. "Why don't you have normal sizes?" I explained that Canada uses the metric system. He said he'd just go to a real hardware store. I told him every hardware store in Canada would be the same. He left anyway. Came back an hour later. Bought the metric screws. Didn't say a word. My cousin lives in Germany. She was at a butcher shop when an American woman asked for 2 pounds of ground beef. The butcher asked if she meant a kilogram. The woman said no, pounds. The butcher said they sell by weight in kilograms. The woman pulled out her phone and started Googling the conversion. Then she said, "So that's like 900 grams?" The butcher said yes, close enough. The woman said, "Why can't you just do pounds? It's simpler." The butcher said, "For you, maybe." The woman didn't get it. I once saw an American couple get genuinely upset at a gas station in France. They couldn't figure out why fuel was so expensive. The price was listed per liter. They thought it was per gallon. When the total came to 85 euros, the husband said there must be a mistake. The attendant explained liters versus gallons. The wife said, "That's a scam. You're taking advantage of tourists." The attendant just shrugged. They paid and left, still convinced they'd been ripped off. A woman came into the grocery store where I worked in Australia. She wanted to buy steak. I asked how much she wanted. She said, "About 1.5 pounds." I started weighing it in grams. She stopped me. "No," I said, 1.5 pounds. I explained we use grams and kilograms. She said, "Can you just weigh it in pounds?" I said, "The scale doesn't do pounds." She said, "This is ridiculous. How do people shop here?" I said, "With grams." She bought chicken instead. I still don't know why. My brother-in-law is a contractor in Dubai. An American client wanted to build a deck. Sent over plans in feet and inches. My brother-in-law converted everything to meters and sent back a quote. The client called, confused about the measurements. My brother-in-law explained the metric system. The client said, "I'm not paying for you to translate my plans." My brother-in-law said he wasn't charging for that. The client insisted the measurements were wrong because they didn't make sense. Took 3 phone calls to sort it out. I worked at a car rental place in Italy. An American asked how many miles per gallon the car got. I said we measure in liters per 100 kilometers. He said, "Can you just convert it?" I said it doesn't work that way directly because it's a different calculation method. He said, "So you don't know how efficient the car is?" I said I did, just in a different unit. He said, "That's not helpful." He rented the car anyway. Brought it back early because he couldn't figure out the fuel gauge. A friend of mine manages a running event in Stockholm. An American participant asked what the race distance was. My friend said 10 kilometers. The American asked how many miles that was. My friend said about 6.2 miles. The American said, "Why not just make it a 10-mile race?" My friend said because it's a 10K race. The American said, "But 10 miles is a rounder number." My friend said, "So is 10 kilometers." The American didn't run the race. I was giving a tour in Edinburgh Castle when an American tourist asked me what year we got our independence from England. I said Scotland is still part of the United Kingdom. She looked confused. She said, "But you have your own flag and everything." I explained that Scotland is a country within the UK. She said, "That doesn't make sense. How can you be a country inside a country?" I started to explain the UK structure. She interrupted. "So you're like a state?" I said, "Not exactly." She said, "You should just be independent." That's what we did. I said we had a referendum in 2014 and voted to stay. She said, "Well, you should vote again until you get the right answer." A guy at a pub in Dublin told me he was excited to be in the UK. I said, "You're in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. That's not the UK." He said, "But you speak English." I said, "So does Australia." He said, "Okay, but it's all the same area." I explained the difference between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. He said it seemed complicated. I said it was very complicated. He said, "You should just all be one country. It'd be easier." I didn't know where to start with that one. My friend works at a museum in Athens. An American visitor asked why all the exhibits were in Greek. My friend said, "Because we're in Greece." The visitor said, "But tourists come here. You should have English." My friend said they do have English translations on most plaques. The visitor said, "Yeah, but it's smaller. The Greek should be smaller." My friend just walked away. I was working at a chocolate shop in Brussels when a tourist asked if we had Swiss chocolate. I said we're in Belgium, famous for Belgian chocolate. She said, "Is there a difference?" I said, "Yes, very much so." She said, "But Europe is small. It's all kind of the same, right?" I said Belgium and Switzerland are different countries with different chocolate-making traditions. She said, "If you say so," and bought a bar. She later left a review saying our Swiss chocolate was disappointing. An American couple came into the bookstore where I worked in Paris. They asked for a map of France. I showed them several options. They picked one and asked me to highlight where Paris was. I pointed to Paris. They seemed surprised it was so far north. The husband said, "I thought Paris was in the middle of France." I said it is in the north-central part. He said, "Doesn't make sense. Capitals should be in the middle." I asked why. He said, "So they're fair to everyone." I said geography doesn't really work that way. He said, "It does in America." I didn't mention that Washington, D.C. is on the East Coast. I was at a hostel in Prague. An American guest asked the receptionist how far it was to Germany. The receptionist said about an hour by train to the border. The guest said, "That's it? How is that even a different country?" The receptionist said, "Because it is." The guest said, "In America, you can drive for 12 hours and still be in Texas." The receptionist said, "Europe is smaller." The guest said, "You guys should combine some of these countries. Make it less confusing." My sister works at a tourist information center in Vienna. An American asked her what language they speak in Austria. She said German. He said, "Why not Austrian?" She explained that Austrian German is a dialect of German, but the language is German. He said, "That's weird. In America, we speak American." She said, "You speak English." He said, "American English. It's different." She said, "Same concept here." He didn't look convinced. I watched an American tourist in Rome argue with a guide about Roman history. The guide said Rome was founded in 753 BC. The tourist said that couldn't be right because America was founded in 1776. The guide said, "Yes, Rome is older than America." The tourist said, "By how much?" The guide said, "About 2,500 years." The tourist said, "That's impossible. Nothing is that old." The guide said, "The Colosseum right behind you is 2,000 years old." The tourist looked at it and said, "They did a good job restoring it." I worked at a cafe in Copenhagen. An American customer asked for coffee. I brought it to him. He took a sip and asked where the refills were. I said there are no free refills. He said, "What kind of place doesn't do refills?" I said most places in Europe. He said that was a scam. I said it's just a different business model. He said, "In America, coffee refills are free. That's how it should be." I said he was welcome to move back to America. He didn't find that funny. He left without tipping, which was fine, because we don't expect tips here anyway. My friend is a server in Montreal. She told me about an American family who got upset because she didn't bring the check immediately after they finished eating. They flagged her down and asked why service was so slow. She explained that in Canada, servers don't rush you out. You ask for the check when you're ready. The father said, "That's inefficient. You should just bring it." She said most people prefer not to feel rushed. He said, "Most people are wrong. I was on a train in Switzerland. An American tourist was talking loudly on his phone. An elderly Swiss woman asked him politely to lower his voice. He said he was having an important conversation. She said it's considered rude to talk loudly on trains. He said, "It's a public space. I can talk how I want." She said, "Not here." He argued with her for another minute before she gave up and moved to another car. He turned to me and said, "Can you believe that lady?" I said I agreed with her. He stopped talking to me. An American couple moved into the apartment above me in Berlin. First week, they threw a party on a Wednesday night. Loud music until 2 a.m. The next morning, I knocked on their door and explained quiet hours. They said they didn't know. I said it's a pretty standard rule in Germany. They said, "We're just living our lives. People need to relax." I said people need to sleep. They said they'd try to keep it down. The next Wednesday, same thing. Building manager got involved. They moved out after 3 months, complaining that Germans were unfriendly. I worked at a cinema in London. An American asked why we assign seats. He said in America, you just sit wherever you want. I explained that most UK cinemas use assigned seating. He said it was unnecessary. I said it prevents arguments over seats. He said, or You could just let people sit where they want and be adults about it. I said, this is the adult way of handling it. He bought a ticket, sat in someone else's seat, argued with them, eventually moved to his assigned seat. Didn't see the irony. My cousin manages a gym in Melbourne. An American member kept leaving weights on the floor. My cousin reminded him to re-rack them. The guy said, "That's what staff is for." My cousin said, "No, members re-rack their own weights." The guy said, "I pay a membership. You should have people to clean up." My cousin said everyone else manages to re-rack their weights. The guy said, "Everyone else is wasting their time." He canceled his membership 2 weeks later. I was at a restaurant in Lyon. An American at the next table snapped his fingers at the waiter. The waiter ignored him. He snapped again. The waiter walked past him to another table. The American got frustrated and called out, "Excuse me, service?" The waiter came over and said in English, "If you need something, you make eye contact or raise your hand politely. We don't respond to snapping." The American said, "I'm trying to get your attention." The waiter said, "You're being rude." The American said, "I'm being efficient." The waiter walked away. A woman came into the bakery where I worked in Amsterdam. She asked for a dozen bagels. I said, "We don't have bagels." She said, "What do you mean you don't have bagels?" I said, "We're a Dutch bakery. We have Dutch pastries." She said, "Everyone has bagels." I said, "Not in the Netherlands." She said, "This is unbelievable. What do people eat for breakfast?" I pointed at the display of pastries. She said, "Those aren't real breakfast food." She left empty-handed. Last story. I was working at a tourist office in Oslo. An American walked in and asked for a map. I gave him one. He looked at it for a minute. Then he asked why everything was in Norwegian. I said, "Because we're in Norway." He said, "But I can't read Norwegian." I said, "There's an English version on the back." He flipped it over, looked at it. Then he asked if we had one in American. I said, "You mean English?" He said, "No, American. Like, with normal words." I said English and American English are the same language. He said they're different dialects. I said the map is in English and will work fine for him. He said, "If you say so," and left. I watched him try to use it upside down for 5 minutes before someone helped him. Here's the thing. I don't think Americans are stubborn or unwilling to learn. I think the problem is simpler than that. When you grow up being told your country is number one, it becomes really hard to accept that other places might do things differently. And that's okay. It's not that other countries are better. It's just that they're different. And different doesn't mean wrong. The funniest part is that most of the time, these situations would be completely fine if people just said, "Oh, I didn't know that. Thanks for explaining." But that's not what happens. What happens is a defense mechanism kicks in. Instead of learning something new, the instinct is to justify why the American way makes more sense, even when it doesn't. I've had so many of these conversations, and they all follow the same pattern. Someone encounters something unfamiliar. They get confused or frustrated. You explain how it works locally, and instead of accepting it, they explain why their way is better. Not different. Better? That's the key word. Maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe it's an education thing. Maybe it's just human nature when you're out of your comfort zone. But I've noticed it way more with Americans than any other nationality. And I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm saying it because I've literally kept count. The stories never stop coming. Every week, someone new. Same pattern. Different details. And honestly, I've kind of gotten used to it. It's part of the job now. You develop a thick skin. You learn which battles to pick. And you learn that some people are just going to leave thinking the entire rest of the world is doing everything wrong. This isn't just content. It's context. And if that matters to you, you'll want to stay connected. But every once in a while, you get someone who stops, listens, says, "Huh, I didn't know that. That's interesting." And those people make the other ones worth dealing with.